Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important and exciting conversation with Vladimir Kara-Murza. First of all, I want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service, the Dean's Office here at the School of Foreign Service, and our partnership with the Renew Democracy Initiative, which we deeply, deeply appreciate. As you know, you're here to see Vladimir Kara-Murza. He is with us here at the School of Foreign Service as the RDI, Renew Democracy Initiative, Dissident-in-Residence, the first dissident-in-residence that we've ever had here at CERES, at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at SFS. And of course, Mr. Kara-Murza has witnessed Russia's entire post-1991 trajectory. Twice poisoned, left in a coma by Putin's secret police. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author became a political prisoner in a maximum security Siberian penal colony for his outspoken opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He is a politician, an author, a historian, and a documentary filmmaker. He was a close colleague, of course, of slain opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. He served himself as deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and was a candidate for the Russian parliament. Leading diplomatic efforts on behalf of the opposition, Kara-Murza played a key role in the adoption of the Magnitsky sanctions against top Russian officials by the US, the UK, the European Union, Canada, and Australia. In April 2020, he was arrested in Moscow for publicly denouncing the invasion of Ukraine and the war crimes committed by Russian forces. He was released only in August 2024 as part of the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War, negotiated by the United States and the German governments. He's a contributing writer at the Washington Post. He's the winner of the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for his columns written from prison, and has previously worked for Echo Moskvy, BBC, RTVI, Kommersant, World Affairs, and other media organizations. He serves as Vice President at Free Russia Foundation, a senior advisor at Human Rights First, and a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Speaking with him today, another one of our own here at the School of Foreign Service, Jill Dougherty is an adjunct professor here at the center. She is, of course, former CNN Moscow bureau chief and the current CNN on-air contributor on Russian affairs. She will interview Mr. Kara-Murza about Russia's trajectory, his remarkable experiences as a modern-day diplomat. She herself is a global fellow at the still surviving Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars, and a member of the Wilson Center's still surviving Kennan Institute Advisory Council. And of course, she served as a correspondent at CNN for 3 decades with expertise in Russia and the post-Soviet region, having served as Moscow's bureau chief for a decade. But also she was a White House correspondent, a foreign affairs correspondent covering the U.S. State Department, U.S. Affairs editor, managing editor of CNN International based in Hong Kong. So with that, we look forward to a fascinating dialogue, an important dialogue, and we welcome Vladimir Kara-Murza and Jill Dougherty. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope, is my microphone working? I hope oh, great, okay. Thank you very much, Joel. Really appreciate that. And I have to say, Vladimir, we know each other personally. However, it is a real honor to be able to talk with you because, you know, as I was listening to your biography, you are all of that. But to me, one of the most important things about you is that you are a moral voice for what we hope will be a better Russia of the future. And so I hope, you know, Georgetown does focus on moral values, and I'm hoping that maybe that can be part of our conversation. So welcome and thank you. So we have roughly an hour, a little bit more, and we were thinking that we would talk for 25 minutes or something because I know there are a lot of people who have questions. So we want to get as many questions as we can. But I'm thinking, I mean, there's a lot that we can talk about, but I think one thing that I get, because I talk with a lot of people, and they all say, what do Russians think about the war or about Putin himself? And you are a Russian, you're outside of the country, but you are definitely in communication with people inside, and I think have probably a good feeling for what the mood is. There are polls, but obviously, you start laughing, but I mean, there are some polls, and it's hard to do a poll with a gun to your head. However, anyway, I would be interested, and I think our audience would be very interested, what is the mood? What do people think about this war against Ukraine? And probably throw in something about what do they think of Mr. Putin.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Georgetown for the very kind invitation, Dean Howland, Professor David Fox. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to everybody who's here. And I have to say it's a true honor to have this conversation led by Jill Dougherty, not only a very good and old friend of mine, but also really the face of CNN coverage of all things Russian for many years, both in the 90s, when things were changing for the better, and then in the 2000s, when things started going in the opposite direction, leading us to where we all are today. And what a question to start our conversation. And of course, Jill, as you know better than anybody, I have to preface my response with a necessary disclaimer that in a country run by a totalitarian dictatorship, it is not possible to answer this question with any degree of accuracy and objectivity and analysis, because by definition, in a totalitarian dictatorship, the outside world sees what the regime wants it to see the propaganda facade. And I'm still actually astonished that although it's been 1 year and, 4 months since I've been out of prison, I'm still astonished by how often I actually get a question speaking in a major Western audience, not just here, but in Europe too. The question is something like, but why do the opinion polls show such high approval of Vladimir Putin and war in Ukraine? I never quite know. I know why you ask this question, you're a professional journalist, but I never quite know if people asking that question are trolling me, if they're making fun, or that is actually a serious question. Because, I can give just one example. I could give many, but I think one would be enough sort of to point to the situation we have in our country. About 6 months ago, a man in Moscow by the name of Yuri Kakhovets received 5 years in prison for responding to an opinion poll question on the street of Moscow saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. He didn't take part in a demonstration, didn't hold a picket, he didn't write anything on social media, he didn't do anything. He was just walking down the street. There was a lady with a camera asking people what they think of the war. He said what he thought of the war. He identified who he was by the video. They tracked him down, came to his home, arrested him, took him to court, and he's now serving a 5-year prison sentence simply for giving response to an opinion poll. So, when somebody asks you why do opinion polls show such high approval of Putin and the war, just remember that guy. And there are so many other examples of this. And of course, this is the case with any totalitarian society. If you look at the last so-called election results in the Soviet Union in the mid-80s, you would see 99.9% in favor of the Communist Party, and yet when the communist regime collapsed in 3 days, in August of 1991, which is how things usually happen in Russia, nobody came to its defense. I wonder where the 99.9% came from. And so I think in the conditions that we have, and this is what I like to call the Boris Nemtsov test. Boris Nemtsov always said that in conditions of a dictatorship, the only objective way, more or less as objective as we can get, way to judge the actual state of public opinion is to see how the regime is responding to it. So you don't look at the so-called polls, the so-called election results. You actually see at the level of the repression that the regime is engaging in. Because there's this very sort of direct and fundamental contradiction between, on the one hand, this Putin propaganda message that everybody in Russia supposedly supports the regime, supposedly supports this brutal and criminal war in Ukraine, and with the actions of the Putin government. To me, actions always speak louder than words. And if you look at the mind-boggling, astonishing levels of repression in Putin's Russia that have long surpassed not just anything we've seen in the post-Soviet period, that goes without saying, but even the late Soviet period as well. Just a sobering and shocking fact that there are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union, that is 15 different countries put together in the mid-1980s. When the Vienna Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe opened in 1987, the Soviet government was known to be holding about 700 known political prisoners, again, across 15 present-day countries, 15 Soviet republics. Today, only from what we know from the public information from human rights organizations like Memorial and OVD Info, There are more than 1,700 known political prisoners in Russia. And I stress this word known, because there are so many people who are not on anybody's list, who are not on anybody's radars, who are not, known and verified by these human rights organizations. There was this talented Russian musician, a pianist named Pavel Kushnir, who died of a hunger strike in the prison in Dissident-in-Residence in eastern Siberia, just 3 days before the 16 of us were saved in our prison exchange that Dean Hellman referred to in August 2024. He died in late July 2024. He was in prison because he'd spoken out against the war in Ukraine. Nobody even knew that he existed before he died. And we don't know how many such Pavel Kushnirs there are around in the Russian Gulag system. So when I put out these figures, I stress again and again that these are only known figures and names of political prisoners, verified cases. Memorial, Russia's leading human rights organizations, co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, estimates that there are more than 4,500 people in Russia currently who are in prison on politically motivated charges, and these are just Russian citizens. That's not counting about 7 or 8 estimated more thousand of Ukrainian civilian detainees. And Memorial recently came out with this absolutely shocking statistic that every single day, 5 people in Russia are targeted with some form of politically motivated persecution, whether it's a criminal case, police detention, administrative arrest, administrative fine. 5 people every single day. If everybody in Russia really did support Putin and support the war, why would they need to do this? A regime that really, to me, it's just sort of the self-evident truth that a regime that really did have the support it claims to have would not need to keep its society in a state of constant fear. And this is the last tool that Putin really has to continue staying in power. He has no shred of legitimacy left. We haven't had a free and fair election in Russia in more than 2 decades. He stayed in power in violation of the constitutional term limits, as everybody knows. For this, both the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Europe's 2 leading parliamentary bodies, officially recognized him as an illegitimate usurper, which he is, even by his own standards. And the only way he can continue to rule is through propaganda, repression, and fear. And so applying the Boris Nemtsov test, looking at this horrendous levels of repression in Putin's Russia, yes, on the one side it tells us how lawless and repressive and brutal this regime is. We all know that. But of course, on the other side, it tells us that there are so many people in Russia who are not willing to turn the other way, who are not willing to turn a blind eye to what is happening, who are not willing to become silent accomplices to the crimes committed by Putin's Kremlin, and who are willing to speak up, even knowing what the price for that is going to be. And the fact that there are so many people like this in my country, frankly, makes me proud of Russia.
You paid that price, obviously. You were in prison, and then you were exchanged. And, I'm interested. I'm thinking of people who've been in prison, let's say Navalny, who went back, and you were there as well. And I'm wondering, I guess his understanding was, you have to do it because you have to be in Russia. And what is your opinion, the danger, I don't know whether I should say, is it all worth it, but being in Russia, being in prison, can you be, if you were outside of the country, can you be as influential or respected by people? Or do you have to be in the country even if you are going to end up in prison in terrible circumstances?
Well, to me, it's not a practical question of, how influential or how respected or not you are. To me, that's all besides the point. It's always been a question of principle for me that a Russian politician has to be in Russia. I think it sounds so simple, but it's just sometimes important to state an obvious truth. That's why I never left after the poisonings. That's why I never left after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. By the way, so many other people didn't leave either. People like Ilya Yashin, people like Oleg Orlov from Memorial. They were both in the same prison exchange that freed me. Because for so many of us, it was a question of basic ethics, if you will. How can I, what moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up against the Putin dictatorship if I was too scared to do it myself? I would never be able to do this sitting at a safe distance. That is just unacceptable. I always felt that a politician has to lead by personal example. That's the only way a political leader, somebody who aspires to be a political leader, can lead. Because words are worth nothing unless you back them up with action. And sort of harking back to your previous question, we talked about the fact that fear is the main tool by which the Putin regime stays in power. But of course, fear only works if people succumb to it. I think one of the most important lessons left to us by the Soviet dissident movement was that at the end of the day, fear is always a personal choice. Yes, the regime will seek to instill fear. It will seek to rule by fear. It will still seek to make fear omnipresent and all-permeating. But at the end of the day, it is up to each individual person to decide whether he or she chooses to be afraid or not. Those 7 people, 7 Russians who came out into Red Square in Moscow in August 1968 and protested the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, showed that it is possible to refuse to be afraid. Many, many years ago, I've still been in Moscow. This was in the mid-2000s. You remember there was this initiative by a group of us in the Russian opposition to nominate Vladimir Kara-Murza, a legendary Soviet dissident, writer, long-time prisoner of conscience, who spent years and years in the Soviet Gulag, for president of Russia. So it's a largely symbolic move, of course, because we knew he would never be allowed on the ballot, and of course he wasn't. That was almost besides the point, because it was there was this very important symbolic initiative that, if these guys are trying to impose KGB rule on us, then we're going to put up the Russian Václav Havel to stand against them. Bukovsky only lost respect to the leaders of the Soviet dissident movement. And so he came back to Moscow, because he was living abroad after his own prison exchange back in the 70s. He came back to Russia. Had several campaign events. And I remember the large rally we had on Triumphальная Square, the old Mayakovsky Square, where, of course, the dissident movement was born in the early 1960s. And, after the rally was over, a lady came up to Bukovsky and she asked him, "Why did you come back? Are you really hoping to change anything here? To go back to sort of the practical aspect of this." And he looked at her and said, no, of course I'm not hoping to change anything. I'm a rational person. But he said, "I came back because people are starting to be afraid again. And when people are starting to be afraid, you have to come, stand next to them, and say, here I am. I'm not afraid." I had goosebumps as I was listening to say that. And those words rang in my head again and again and again. In February, March, April 2022, after Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and immediately, the same week, the Russian government shut down what remained of independent media outlets. Not many left by then, but outlets like Echo of Moscow, Radio Novaya Gazeta, totally shut down. And they passed all these laws, if I can call them laws, that added new articles to the criminal code that made it a criminal offense, not just to speak out against the war, to just actually call it a war. The people in prison in Russia today for calling the war in Ukraine a war. It's literally George Orwell come true. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. That's the reality of Putin's Russia. And I remember the atmosphere of those days when, fear was everywhere. Everywhere you looked, you walked on the streets, you could sense it. And so many people did leave in those weeks, after February 2022. And actually the largest exodus of people from Russia in the modern times. For many of us in the political opposition movement, for people like Ilya Yashin, for people like Oleg Orlov, for people like me, it was a question of principle to stay. Because when people are starting to be afraid again, you have to come, stand next to them, and say, here I am. I'm not afraid. And I was afraid, by the way. I'm a human being. I'm not a Superman. Nobody wants to go to prison. I've read enough literature about the Gulag. I've known enough people like Bukovsky and Sharansky and many others personally to know that it's not going to be a walk in the park. But this is what I do. I've been in politics for more than 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov when I was 18 years old, still a student, 26 years ago now. This is what I've been doing. And that's what I'm a Russian politician. And it's always been a question of principle for me that a Russian politician has to be in Russia. And I find myself, as does Ilya, as does Oleg, and so many others, in a really bizarre situation where I'm outside of Russia having never left. Because, when our exchange happened, none of us knew. None of us were asked. They just brought us like cattle from our prison cells to the bus, to the airport, and threw us out to Turkey, because Putin really needed his FSB assassin back from the German prison. So we never left. We never opted to leave, but here we are now, forcibly outside of the country. So I have to say it's a really bizarre situation. But I have absolutely no doubt that I will be back, and I hope one day to have lunch with you in Moscow.
I hope so. I hope so. Very inspiring words. I have to kind of play the devil's advocate a little bit here, because I covered, when I was permanently assigned to Moscow, I was there from 97 to 2005, but I had been going since late 80s to cover various things. So I saw, early, let's say, kind of late dissident movement, then early Russia, et cetera. And the question that I will ask you is, it has always struck me that the opposition, for lack of a better word, but the opposition seems to be eternally divided and eternally fighting each other. And, of course, everyone wishes it were not so, but, I mean, I guess you would have to agree that that's the case. If you do agree, why, and what could possibly be done now that, to bring them together with some type of vision? Because, I go to a lot of discussions here in D.C., and a lot of Russians come through D.C., and many times they're saying, this is our vision of, the next version of Russia. This is what we want to happen after Putin. So just talk about the opposition, if you would.
Well, first of all, of course I agree with what you're saying. I mean, it's just an obvious fact, unfortunately. And by the way, not to say this as an excuse, but just to sort of state a fact that this problem affects many other democratic opposition movements in totalitarian regimes. Many of our colleagues in Venezuelan opposition, Cuban, Iranian, Chinese, Belarusian, you name it. That is a problem, this internal division, internal squabbles that sometimes, or even I could say often, overshadow the common fight against dictatorship. That is a very important problem. It's a lingering problem. Part of the explanation is actually sort of a good one, because that's what makes, small d Democrats different from fascists and other totalitarians. It's they who are marching to the same tune and following orders. We, by definition, are people with our own strong opinions, and our opinions may differ very often, and then that's okay, and that's normal. But having said that, it is more than counterproductive when members and leaders of these democratic opposition movements spend more time and energy fighting each other than they are uniting a common front against a dictatorship. I mentioned a few times Boris Nemtsov. One of his many, many amazing qualities was the fact that he was always able, as you know, to sort of put his own personal ambition on the back burner and always try to find common ground with other groups, other leaders, put everybody around the same table to prioritize the common struggle before all of these sort of internal squabbles. And that's always been my position too. I've always said, and I say it now again, that whatever differences we have, and we do have differences, and again, that's normal in the democratic community, but whatever differences we have, they are nothing in comparison to the tyrant and murderer who's sitting in the Kremlin and the danger he represents. And all these differences we would be able to sort out and debate in a future democratically elected parliament in Russia, when we have one, but we need to get one first. And so I fully share your sentiment. And I can say on a personal level that, in all my years in politics, I've been trying to do whatever I can to try to find common language, common ground with people with whom I may disagree. I'm proud of the fact that in the 2003 parliamentary election, which you were covering, still based in Moscow, I was the only candidate in the whole of Russia to be jointly nominated by the Union of Right Forces, Boris Nemtsov's party, and Yabloko, Grigory Alinsky's party, the two main democratic opposition parties in Russia at the time, that again spent a lot of time fighting each other rather than Putin. But I was nominated jointly by both of them, and I'm proud of that fact. And with all the difficulties that entails, we are trying to continue this coalition building now. As you know, these last year and a bit now, since I've been out of prison, since Ilya Yashin has been out of prison, we've organized several demonstrations, unified opposition events, together with Yulia Navalny, Alexei's widow, Ilya Yashin, and myself. We've been working in cooperation with many other groups. And one of the concrete, specific initiatives that I hope, apart from everything else that makes this important, that I hope will actually serve to teach people how to sit down around the same table and work together, will be this platform for Russian democratic forces that's about to be created at the Council of Europe, literally in 2 weeks' time, less than that now. So just
Can you
of course, just by way of brief background.
This is important.
So the Council of Europe is the largest and oldest pan-European organizations based around the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a sort of a document that brings together some of the most important principles like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of elections, and so on, signed originally back in 1950, more than 3/4 of a century ago, and it now includes 46 countries across the continent. Every single European country except Russia and Belarus is a member, for obvious reasons, because those are the two last dictatorships in Europe. Russia was actually a member, joined up in the 1990s in the brief time of our democracy, and Russia was expelled by the Council of Europe in 2022 after Putin attacked Ukraine, again for obvious reasons. But when they took that decision to expel Russia as a state from the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe made a special provision that we will continue to maintain a dialogue with the Russian democratic forces, the human rights community, the civil society, democratic opposition, because we realize, that not all of Russia is Putin, and there are so many people in Russia who are against Putin, against the war, and we want to continue this conversation with them because Russia is the largest country in Europe. It's sort of very difficult to have a pan-European organization without the largest country represented. And so in 2 weeks' time, this provision is about to take practical shape, when there will be a platform, essentially a de facto Russian opposition delegation, seated at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. There was already one for Belarus that was created a few months ago. And so in this sense, the Council of Europe will be complete, with those two countries that are absent on a government level being present at the level of opposition and civil society. And so as we speak, this process of shaping and creating this platform is underway. We don't know the composition yet. It will only be announced on January 25th, so less than 2 weeks from now. And apart from, having the importance of actually being the first official international platform that will bring together parliamentarians from European democracies and the leaders of the Russian democratic opposition and civil society, apart from another very important aspect, that this will actually be the first official platform where we will be sitting together with Ukrainian delegates, because of course Ukraine is a member of the Council of Europe, so their parliamentarians will be part of that body. It will also have, I'm hoping, secretly, not so secretly anymore because I just said it, but I'm hoping that it will also have the added effect of teaching our groups in the Russian democratic opposition to actually sit around the same table, talk to each other, and work together. Because, we have not had a real parliament in Russia for more than 20 years. The last time, this is not my opinion, if you go to the page of the webpage of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is sort of the gold standard for election observation for European countries and wider, you will see, according to their reports, the last time Russia had a free, fair, and competitive election for parliament was in 1999. A lot of people who are alive today, who are adults today, don't even have a memory of that anymore. And that parliament ended, I worked in that parliament with Boris Nemtsov, his advisor. That parliament ended in 2003. And in 2003, we had the first election, and post-Soviet times it was rigged in favor of Putin's party. And when the opposition was kicked out again, Joe, you have first-hand memories of that, covering that election. So we have not had a real parliament in more than 2 decades. And so we have no way of learning these skills. And so I'm hoping this quasi-parliamentary body that will be the platform of the Council of Europe will bring together different representatives of different opposition groups. We'll actually have the added effect of being a training ground, if you will, a school of parliamentary work. And it will actually help at least solve some of the problems that you raised in your question of these divisions and these squabblings that are, again, in my view, totally damaging and counterproductive to the common cause.
You just check the time here. Maybe one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. There's something, Michael David Fox and I, the head of CERES, we were talking about Russia's trajectory, and I noticed Dean Hellman used the same word, the trajectory of Russia. You just used this phrase, the brief period of our democracy. And, I guess my question, just simply is, why was it brief? What happened? Because I remember those days. I remember Gorbachev. I remember people, early Yeltsin, on the streets saying, with fervor and tears in their eyes, saying, Yeltsin, Yeltsin. And then 1999, as you know,
right.
And Putin comes in 2000, and I guess, it really is a question for historians, but I would love your shorthand version of what happened, and big focus on Putin, but it has to be more complicated.
Oh, of course, Putin was only the result.
Well,
and as you know, I'm a historian by education, not just a politician, so I think and write and speak about this question a lot. Not so much because it's interesting to study the past, but because we have to make sure not to repeat those mistakes in the future. Because, unlike what it may seem today, Putin is not forever, and his regime is not forever. Things will change, and there will be a window of opportunity in Russia for democracy again. And given our history, we know that things usually happen, big change usually comes like that, swiftly, suddenly, totally unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist Empire in 1917 and the communist dictatorship in 1991 collapsed in 3 days. Very literally, what you just referred to in August 1991. And no one saw it coming. It will be exactly the same next time. None of us knows when it will happen. We do know that it will come swiftly and suddenly. We also know the window of opportunity will be brief, because they always are, by definition. And so one of the biggest concerns that I have, and I know many of my friends and colleagues in the opposition have as well, is how not to repeat those mistakes that were committed in the 90s that brought us to where we are today. And we can talk for hours about this, but just to summarize it and sort of to take out what to me is most important, there was one very big domestic mistake that was committed by the Russian authorities, by the Russian democratic government in the 90s. And there was one very important mistake committed by the West in the 1990s that led us to where we are today. So the domestic mistake, which is the more important one, of course, is the fact that there was never really any accountability for the crimes of the Soviet regime. We know, and speaking as a historian here, we know from the history of any country in the 20th century that has successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, be it Argentina after the military junta, South Africa after apartheid, Central Eastern European states after the collapse of communism, Germany, of course, first after 45 and then again in the eastern parts after 89. All of these countries, in the different ways and formats, had this process of a public reckoning with the crimes that were committed on behalf of these nations by the totalitarian regimes. You know, in South Africa, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In Argentina, they had the judicial tribunals. And if you haven't seen it, I really recommend the movie Argentina 1985. It's specifically about that, the tribunals after the junta was overthrown in the 1980s. In Central Eastern European states, they had these lustrations procedures where they passed laws to make sure that people who were part of the former regimes would never again be able to come to positions of power and so on. And of course, a central tenet of all of these processes was transparency. All the crimes committed by these regimes were brought out into the open. You know, in Germany, anybody to this day can come to this federal Stasi institution, right, the former East German secret police, take their files and read it. We had nothing of the sort in Russia. We had no full openings of the archives. We had no lustrations of any kind. We had no judicial tribunals. The KGB was only renamed instead of disbanded. And there were people, this is important to say, we're not just, you know, so clever here 40 years on or 35 years on. There were people at the time who were demanding all these measures. People like Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I mentioned. People like Galina Starovoytova, whom I'm sure you knew personally,
Yes.
a member of parliament from St. Petersburg. She was one of the leaders of the Russian democratic movement. They were arguing forcefully back in the early 1990s for the opening of the archives of the Communist Party and the KGB, for judicial tribunals against people responsible for crimes committed under the communist regime, for lustrations, whereby you would make this impossible for old Communist Party bosses or KGB operatives to ever come to positions of power. Galina Starovoytova twice introduced into the Russian parliament a draft law on lustrations. Had it been passed, Putin would not have been able to have been even deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, let alone prime minister or president of Russia, because he was a KGB officer. And yet in the end, none of this happened. Because I guess the post-Soviet inertia proved too strong. People said, okay, we got rid of this regime, forget about it. Let's just sweep it under the carpet and move on. Well, guess what? It doesn't work this way. Because if evil is not publicly accounted for and publicly condemned, this is important, it is going to come back. And here's the answer to your question about 1999. How is it possible that only 8 years after our democratic revolution, a KGB officer came to power? It's because of that. It's because there was never any reckoning and any responsibility and any accountability. You know, when Bukovsky was talking to Yeltsin's officials about this in the early 90s, people would shrug at him and say, we're not going to do this. What you're proposing, they said, is going to be a witch hunt. That's how they termed it. And he looked at them and said, well, in that case, the witches are going to come back and start hunting us. And this is exactly what happened in 1999. We cannot afford to repeat that next time. In the post-Putin Russia, there will have to be a real reckoning, a real transparency, a real accountability for all the crimes that are being committed in Ukraine, that are being committed in Georgia, in Syria, against the people of Russia. The assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the assassination of Alexei Navalny, the persecution of thousands upon thousands of political prisoners during Putin's years. There will have to be a real accountability for this. That's the domestic part. The international part, also very important. We know, and you know very well, covering not just Russia, but other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we know how important this prospect of European and Euro-Atlantic integration was for countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and Baltic states and others, serving as an incentive, that light at the end of the tunnel for continuing these difficult, painful, but necessary democratic and market reforms. You know, when Václav Havel, the president of then still Czechoslovakia, addressed the American Congress in February of 1990, he described the whole process of post-communist transformation in his country as, and I quote, our return to Europe. This was important for these countries. It gave them that light at the end of the tunnel for which they were striving, and they did. And we see that they're all successful democracies today, countries like Czech Republic and Slovakia and the Baltic states and Poland and so on. Russia never really had that promise in the early 90s. The West was not really ready, or perhaps not really willing, to include Russia in that process of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. You know, when the Putin propaganda tries to claim that the problem for all of this, what's happening now, is that NATO expanded too much in the 1990s, that's the exact opposite of the truth. The problem was NATO did not expand enough. Because on December the 20th, 1991, President Boris Yeltsin of Russia wrote a letter to Manfred Wörner, the then Secretary General of NATO, where he, for the first time, officially and publicly, because this letter was made public, raised the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. December the 20th, 1991. That letter never even got a response. And many years ago, before my arrest, I was writing a piece about this issue for a Polish Foreign Affairs magazine. And I went to the Library of Congress here in Washington, other libraries and archives, just to look at the sources, the documents, the newspaper clippings, to see how was it possible that something of this importance from the president of Russia was just totally ignored. And at the end of the day, all the sources go back to the same point. Western leaders were so shocked by the sudden demise of the Soviet system because it was supposed to be forever, and then it was gone in 3 days. They did not know what to do. The New York Times article on that incident, and I'll never forget that quote for as long as I live, it said NATO officials were too taken aback by Yeltsin's offer to come up with a coherent response. This was the phrase they used. Well, this is just not good enough, because we know the price of that failure. And the fact that Russia lacked this incentive of European Euro-Atlantic integration in the 90s did a great disservice to the efforts to build a sustainable democracy, to respond to your question. And I say all this again, not just to dwell on the past, although I'm a historian, I love dwelling on the past, but because we need to make sure that mistake is not repeated, this time from the Western side, the day after Putin, if you kind of put it this way. And that Western leaders, when the Putin regime is gone, will have to stand ready and willing to help and assist and integrate that post-Putin democratic Russia as one of its own into the European and Euro-Atlantic community. And this is important not just for us in Russia, but also for everybody in the West. To go back to this point about the Council of Europe, when the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe took that decision, passed that resolution unanimously to create a Russian democratic platform, I was sitting there on the balcony listening to the debate, and it was so important for me to hear one European lawmaker after another, different countries, different political groups, but they made the same point, that this is important for us, meaning Western Europe too, because they said the only true way to a peaceful and secure Europe is a democratic Russia. And that is absolutely true. Just enough to look at the map. Russia is the largest country in Europe. For as long as our country will continue to have a repressive, criminal, dictatorial regime, it's always going to be a threat, not just to our own people, but also to everybody around us, as the world is seeing the worst possible way the last almost 4 years now with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Because when Russia is repressive at home, it is also going to be aggressive abroad. And so this is in the interest of all of us. And if we do not want our kids and grandkids to deal with another Putin 20 years down the line, the West also, not just us, but the West also has to be ready to act fast the moment that window of opportunity opens after Putin is gone.
We'll go to questions in 2 seconds, but you reminded me, Vladimir Putin uses that in his statements that are pure propaganda. Where
Twisting it or manipulating it.
He says,
yeah.
Europe says they wanted us, but they tricked us, they faked us out.
Using mafia language, by the way, just for people who don't speak Russian, sounds much better in English when you translate it, but it's mafia-style language.
So, but he uses this.
What's the English translation for that? Yeah. It's like machit sartiri. There's no adequate translation, right? You have to.
Exactly. Well, how would you translate that into English, right?
Machit sartiri or kinuch?
Yeah, I mean, just for our Russian, there are some Russian students here, and I love profanity, because, you know, in the old days, women were not exposed to profanity in Russian. So all my friends who were, you know, guys, knew a lot more vocabulary than I did. So I'm eager to expand my vocabulary.
Yeah.
Well, listen, let's not worry about that.
But no, you're absolutely right, that Putin uses that very skillfully.
Yeah.
He twists it, he manipulates it, of course, to his own end. But as with any propaganda message from a totalitarian regime, you know, I think it was Lord Tennyson who said that a half-truth is worse than a lie. That's actually a good example of half-truth, because there is a grain of truth in that, with what I was saying, but of course Putin twists that on its head and uses it to justify his own unprovoked, illegal, criminal war of aggression, which now surpassed in time, by the way, the Soviet Union's war against Hitler between 1941 and 1945, and which actually now is the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. There's no justification for that. But yes, his propaganda is very skillful. In this case, much more skillful than the Soviet one was. That was very straightforward, sort of very primitive. These guys are much more sophisticated in this. Yes, and that's one of the points they twist, and that's one of the points they use to justify their actions, to justify the unjustifiable.
I think we can go to questions. How are we? I think we have some microphones, so please, if you raise your hands, and we'll get some questions. Maybe we start with the gentleman right there, and then we'll move down to this gentleman.
All right. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak today. Your story is very moving, and I hope that Russia does change in the way that you hope as well. But I did want to ask, you've identified and sympathized with the idea that many people in Russia are afraid, and that Putin does not have as much support as he claims to. But there are still all of the people that are part of the state, the well over hundreds of thousands, if not millions, state employees. How do you address your aspiration for accountability to avoid the establishment pursuing, if there is ever a change in leadership in Russia, with also what is just quantitatively a large number of state supporters who are not going out of their way to defy the regime?
Sure, thank you so much. That's a profoundly important question. Of course, there are a lot of people who support what Putin is doing, who are part of what Putin is doing. First of all, let's not forget, and again, Jill is somebody who knows this firsthand, that the first target of Putin's regime when he came to power all those years ago, 26 years ago now, can you believe that? Just for a second, 26 years. There are people in Russia who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to university, got married, had children, got a job. Many have now died fighting in Ukraine. And all of this time, just one guy has been in power. You've had 5 presidents. Just think about this for a second. And so his first target, literally, when he came in, was going after independent media. You know, when he came to power, most of Russian television channels were independent of the government, like in any normal country. The first attack he ordered on the headquarters of Media Most, the largest private media holding in Russia at the time, was on the 4th day after his inauguration as president in May 2000. When I say he started with the independent media, I mean it's literally 4 days. And by 2003, which is again more than 20 years ago, all television channels that were privately held and independent of the government were either shut down or taken over by the state. So our society has existed for more than 2 decades, a generation, with total state control over the main sources of information for millions of our people. So let's not discount that. When you have decades of propaganda from the state every single day, of course it's going to affect some people, no question about it. And yes, there are millions of people who support what Putin is doing. And there are probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands, who are actually personally complicit in war crimes. Let's not forget, there are 2 different layers of international law. One is something that is very, very important. Last year, the Council of Europe, this organization we keep coming back to, established a special international tribunal based in The Hague for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And that's a tribunal that is designed to go after the top levels of the Putin regime, starting with Putin himself. Because the crime of aggression, by definition, can be committed only by somebody who has the power to commit aggression, right? So that's the top leadership. But then there's a separate layer of international law, also coming out of The Hague with the International Criminal Court, which, as you know, has already issued an arrest warrant for Putin over war crimes in Ukraine back in 2023. And that court has jurisdiction to prosecute war crimes committed by anybody, all the way, you know, from the top generals down to the lowest private. And I think this is very important avenue that we'll have to pursue after Putin is gone. Of the two mistakes that we talked about in the 90s, of course, the first one was much more important, the failure to have accountability for Soviet citizens who committed a crime. And that's going to be the same after Putin is gone. You know, when we talk to our Ukrainian colleagues in the Council of Europe and elsewhere, I say to them, it's just as important for us, Russians, to have that accountability for these war criminals as it is for Ukraine. Because Russia is not going to have a normal democratic future unless we deal with these criminals in the way that's opposite to how it was done in the early 90s. And so it's going to be a mammoth task. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people involved in these war crimes, but it will have to be done. And what's important about these tribunals, even while they cannot physically get these people for now, they're already working on gathering evidence and collecting all the documents and basically building all the indictments. And as soon as the political situation in Russia changes, we'll have to go ahead with that. Because, you know, it's too simplistic and it's wrong to say, oh, it's just the fault of Putin and his close entourage. No. Because there are hundreds of thousands of people who have, you know, for money, but that doesn't excuse anything, going out and volunteering to fight against Ukraine. There are all these people who are personally committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, by the way, too. So it's not just Putin and his entourage. Neither, by the way, is it all 140 million people in Russia, because that's sometimes a simplistic sort of narrative in the West, too, which is totally counterproductive, to say that all Russians are guilty. No. Guilt, by definition, is an individual thing. But there are hundreds of thousands of people who are. And all of them, every single one of them, will have to be dealt with. And we know sometimes it takes a long time. There are still 100-year-old, literally, former Nazi concentration camp guards who are still being indicted in Germany. The latest case was, I think, like 2 months ago. There was this woman who was a secretary in one of the death camps in Nazi Germany. There's still people alive from there. And that process is still going on. However long it takes, however much effort or money or government resources it will take, we will have to pursue that. Not just for Ukraine and for international justice, but also for the sake of the future of Russia as well. Thank you for your question.
Could we talk to this gentleman, please? And sorry, could you identify yourself quickly, just briefly?
Good afternoon, Mr. Kara-Murza. My name is Isak Kulalic. We spoke back in September. I actually work here.
This building downstairs.
Welcome to the business school.
Okay.
Yeah. My question for you, and maybe you can even take these two questions, and please forgive if I ramble a little bit. Do you consider Vladimir Putin to be the linchpin of this regime? Could you see a situation in which, one way or another, Putin goes away, but his totalitarianism remains? And building off of that, is there any ministers, secretaries, etc., in his government who are early to mid-career who you think we should be looking at with a discerning eye going forward?
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. The answer to your first one is very simple. Yes, Putin is the linchpin of everything. And the reason I say this so easily is because, you know, the big difference between, for example, the Soviet dictatorship, or what they still have in China, the communist dictatorship, yes, and the regime that we have in Russia, is, you know, they were or still are ideological dictatorships, right? Like in the Chinese system, you can, you know, change Hu Jintao for Xi Jinping, and the regime is still in place, the authority is still there. Same in the Soviet Union. Although, of course, with important differences within. Khrushchev was very different from Stalin, but still the dictatorship itself stayed in power. There's no ideology here. This is a personalistic dictatorship. They made it themselves. They call it the vertical of power. That's their own term. That's the term Putin uses often. Vertical that goes up to the same individual. The moment that individual is gone in one way or another, this whole system will crumble like a house of cards. And we know this again from our own history, even when it was actually an ideological dictatorship. When Stalin died, you know, at his funeral, Khrushchev and Malenkov took the decision to end Soviet participation in the Korean War, for example, which led to the Korean armistice in 1953, the same year that Stalin died. And millions of people began to be released from the Gulag the following year. Because Stalin's was also more personalistic than an ideological regime. This is a totally personalistic regime. There's no ideology here. And to your second question about people around Putin, I'm sure a lot of people in and around the Kremlin actually hate Putin more than they hate us. Because with what he has done, he has totally destroyed their entire raison d'etre. Because for many years, decades, these people have gotten used to stealing in Russia, and then spending and stashing away that money in the West. That was their whole reason for them being there. And suddenly that stopped with all the sanctions introduced after Putin. They hate it, except they're all terrified. They're afraid, just like with Stalin. The moment he's gone, there's going to be, I'm not saying the next day there will be a successful liberal democracy, of course not, but there will be a very important window of opportunity, in the way there often was in the past, when these heads of personalistic dictatorships were gone. And again, as a historian, I would just point to the fact that, if you look back at 2.5+ centuries of Russian history, you will see this unmistakable model. Every time you have a change of leadership at the top, even when the next leader comes either from the same family, as was the case in Imperial Russia, or from the same political circle, as was the case in the Soviet Union, you had a 180-degree turn in policy. Every single time since 1762, when Catherine the Great came to power in a coup against her own husband, all the way up till now, every time there was a leadership change, you had a 180-degree shift. I mean, you can't think of two more different emperors in the 19th century than Nicholas I and Alexander II. The first being an epitome of repression and war and everything that we know as the darkest time in the 19th century. And Alexander II brought in the Great Reform with the abolition of serfdom and trial by jury and independent universities and local electoral self-government and so on. He was his son. In the 20th century, I mentioned already Stalin and Khrushchev. I mean, Khrushchev was a personal acolyte of Stalin. He was personally complicit in the terror of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And yet he was the one who released millions of people from the Gulag. I mean, Putin was appointed by Yeltsin, essentially. He completely destroyed his legacy. Every single time, this is what happens when there's a leadership change in Russia. To be fair, one exception. Konstantin Ustinovich Chernenko, 1984, who was in power, I believe, for 11 months, spent all that time in intensive care in hospital and died. He couldn't change it. But with that one exception, every time there was a leadership change, there was a shift. I do not see why 250+ year model should fail next time. I don't see any reason for that. Again, not to say that things will be perfect and that Russia will suddenly be a successful democracy and next day after Putin. But it is to say there will be that window of opportunity and we have to get ready for it now to make sure we get it right. Thank you so much for those questions.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions. Just want to make sure we can go to 3:45, correct? Okay, great. Let's move over here. We'll start over there and we'll get some of these questions, okay? And again, if you could identify yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Matthew Bay. I'm an alum from here. I work for U.S. government, going to Moscow, inshallah, down the road. You talk, with respect, you talk about 250 years of history, but there is a consistent strain on that side of views almost of empire towards obviously neighboring regions and regions within Russia. So can you speak to how you and others in the opposition, can you speak to views now towards not just Ukraine and Belarus, but towards Russia's own regions and issues such as self-determination there?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. First of all, just as a one-word answer on Ukraine, for example, because sometimes this question comes up, and I'll never get tired of responding to it. The only legitimate borders that we as Russian Democrats recognize are the borders of 1991. And any legitimately elected democratic government in Russia will go back to these borders, including Crimea, including Donbass. Everything Putin sees from Ukraine has to go back. Ворованное нужно возвращать, as this Russian saying. If you've stolen, you have to give back. So just sort of, because you mentioned Ukraine, I'll say that too. On the question of all the regions within Russia. Now, as you know, Russia is a country of 11 time zones, 190+ different nationalities, all 4 major world religions indigenously, historically represented there: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism. A country that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. In my view, and many of my friends and colleagues too, the only way you can have such a diverse and different country actually functioning properly is with true autonomy for the regions and for the localities and for the indigenous nations, as a federation or even confederation, which Russia never really was, apart from perhaps that brief period in the 90s. Russia's a federation by name, right? If you open our constitution, it has many nice things there, including the titles. The Constitution of the Russian Federation. We're not a federation. It's a vertical power. Everything's ruled, from one office in the Kremlin. And this is just not, apart from being morally wrong, it's just also not sustainable in practice. You cannot rule a vast country like this from one office. And so our view is for Russia to become a true federation, or perhaps even a confederation like Canada, where you have the regions having full autonomy, not just in the matters of language and culture, that goes without saying, but also in matters of tax, for example, and budgets, and everything in a true confederation. Again, Canada is such a good example on so many levels. I mean, it's, when Ilya Yashin recently went there, and it was his first visit, and we chatted with him afterwards, and I said, what do you think of Canada? He said, well, it's Россия здорового человека. It's a Russia of a healthy person, because it's a vast country, it's a cold country, it's a very diverse country, and yet it's a functioning democracy. There's no reason Russia cannot be that as well. But for that reason, first, and this is really a consensus, for all the bickerings and arguments in the Russian opposition, that is a consensus. Russia post-Putin has to be a parliamentary system. Enough with one person holding on the levers of power. It's wrong, it doesn't work. Even when it's a good person like Boris Yeltsin, it still doesn't end well because the system's wrong. So it has to be a system within build checks and balances and coalition building and compromise seeking, a parliamentary system. But also it has to be a true federation with as much autonomy devolved down to the regions as possible. And really, again, if you look like Canada, the only real sort of decisions that are made on the federal level, on the national level, are foreign policy, defense, and the currency. I mean, that's how it happens in a true federation. In Russia, everything down to building a local playground in Khabarovsk is decided by Putin. You've covered many of these direct lines, so on. That's literally what they talk about. It's crazy. And so a true federation with true autonomy, and actually, again, keep going back to this platform of the Council of Europe, the way it's going to be structured is that by the decision of the Council of Europe, 1/3 of the seats in the Russian delegation, so 4 out of the 12, are specifically reserved from representatives of indigenous regions and national minorities. So, because again, Russia is 190 plus different nationalities, and it's our richness, it's our strength, it's not our weakness. And by the way, just like here in America, what is like a full-blooded Russian, if that's even a word? You wouldn't find people like that anymore. I mean, Russia's been a real melting pot in the 20th century, no less than the United States has been. I look at my own family history. I have, out of my 4 great-grandfathers, every single one was of a different nationality, different religious affiliation, and totally different career path. Just look at and everybody will tell you the same story. There's no such thing as, ethnic Russians or whatever. We all mixed up, and that's a good thing. And so I think that's the only way a country of this size and this diversity can function. And that's a big part. Those are probably, with all the arguments internally within the opposition, those are probably the only 2 real points of consensus. A parliamentary system instead of presidential, and a federation instead of a centralized empire. And those are the 2 things I fully subscribe to as well.
Let's get some women in this discussion. How about the woman right here?
Hi, my name's Mimi Wrights. I was previously at Freedom House, but now I'm a student in journalism. My question is about the gutting of U.S. foreign aid, and in your view, how has that affected the Russian dissident movement of today?
Well, there are many. Thank you so much for this question. There are a lot of comparisons that are being made between the situation in Russia today and what was happening under the Soviet system, and there are good grounds for these comparisons. The one big difference to me is the behavior of the Western world towards the situation in our country. Because if you go back to the, let's say, early 1980s, the Andropov time, which in many ways is very similar to the situation we have today, you would see the leaders of the Western world, specifically President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher, take an uncompromising, firm, clear position against the communist dictatorship in support of democratic aspirations of people living behind the Iron Curtain. If you reread Reagan's Westminster speech in 1982, which I often do, which reads just as topical today as it did 4 decades ago, that was a speech that gave rise to this U.S. infrastructure of supporting democracy abroad, including organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, RRI, NDI, and so on. And it wasn't just words, it was actions. And to me, one of the most important factors in leading up to the collapse of the communist system was the fact that the Western world back then actually helped people living behind the Iron Curtain, for example, get access to objective and truthful information about what was happening. All the radio broadcasts with organizations like the Voice of America, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, and so on, where, they'd be beaming shortwave radio signals literally across the Iron Curtain to reach millions of people inside the Soviet bloc in their own languages, right? In Russian, in Ukrainian, in Latvian, in Czech, and Polish. And this played a huge role, to my mind, of delegitimizing the communist system from the inside and leading to its collapse. Fast forward to today, this is not what we're seeing from the United States of America. In fact, we're seeing the very opposite. The total destruction of the infrastructure of the USA, right? USA international development. The weakening of other democracy supporting organizations like IRI and NDI that are functioning at bare minimum capacity. The information space, and I mentioned Voice of America, it is no more because the current US administration's just shut it down almost a year ago, March 2025, literally like this at a couple of days' notice. It is just gone. And so instead of helping people living under Putin's dictatorship to get to the truth, the current US government is actually helping Putin suppress that truth. And it's not just the government, by the way. It's also the US big tech, and it's important to say that too. A few months ago, we had an op-ed, joint op-ed, in the Washington Post, co-written by Yulia Navalny, Ilya Yashin, and myself, where we drew attention to the fact that in the last 6 months of 2024, Apple, the company that all of us know, many of us have these phones in our pockets, Apple took down more than 50 VPN services from its App Store in Russia. VPN services being services that allow you to circumvent official censorship and get access to independent news websites and social media. Apple took down more than 50 VPN services because they want to continue doing business and making money in Vladimir Putin's Russia, because that's what Putin asked them to. And they did. So that's the big difference between now and the early 1980s. Back then, you had Western leaders firmly and clearly on the side of democracy against dictatorship. That's not what we can say today.
Yeah, I worked for VOA for 6 years.
Before CNN.
USSR division.
Right.
Okay, could we go in the middle of the woman right there?
Hi, I'm Sophia Schrombus-Saxon. Kind of great segue, talking about businesses and making money, and connecting back to the topic of accountability. In a kind of post-Putin, more restored democracy, do you think it's possible to fully clean house, given how entrenched the oligarchy is in Russian society, business, and the economy? Or do you foresee it being something more like Germany, where you have firms and families like Bayer, Siemens, Volkswagen, who are still tacitly allowed to continue doing business, provided that they kind of recede from the more kind of political and governmental life and back into kind of their squares in the business world?
Thank you so much. That's a fundamental issue, and I can say, from the outset that it's going to be a very long and difficult road. Nobody's pretending that, or any of these issues that we're discussing, but especially an issue that you raised, which is connected, of course, to transition and justice. Nobody's pretending that it's going to be, an easy journey. But we know that it can be done. Yes, not perfect. And the German example is actually one of the not so good ones, as we know. There are other examples in other post-totalitarian countries where it's been done better. Latin America, South Africa, actually. And of course, as Bukowski said in the early 90s when he was arguing for the illustrations in the opening of the archives, he was saying, making it clear that we are not calling for Gulag in reverse. We're not calling that, now the communist dictatorship is gone. Let's put all of them, where we were. No, that's not what we're saying. Because what they did was persecution, what we are calling for is justice. And to your question, I would say that, yes, it's not possible to process millions of people, through these individual tribunals. And first of all, you don't need to. For that, it's the transparency part that's important. I was giving my final statement at Moscow City Court before I handed my 25-year sentence in April 2023. I said to them that, I know the day will come when Russian society will open its eyes and be horrified by the description of the crimes that were committed on their behalf. And that's the first part of the equation, right? It's transparency and accountability. Transparency comes first. All the information about the crimes committed has to be put out into the open for everyone to see. Because so many people are actually not aware of it, right? Because of the censorship and propaganda that is going on in Putin's Russia today. And then the second part, accountability, those people who actually are guilty, and that includes the oligarchs and the big business types. Many of them are directly complicit, for example, in Putin's military industrial production. Of course they have to be held accountable. But that's not to say that, everybody who was in business, for example, in this time in Russia, they will all have to go to prison. No, that would also not be in conformity with the rule of law. And that'll be difficult, right, to try to gradate that responsibility between people who are just sort of generally politically responsible and people who are actually complicit in the crimes. And that's the difference between political responsibility and actual criminal responsibility. And when we engage in that process, we will need all the help we can get, including from jurists from countries who have walked this path before. And there will be many. Again, what's positive here? I know it sounds like really negative now. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be long. But on the positive side, we don't have to invent the wheel here. It has been done with various degrees of success. And we will need all the help and advice we can get from countries that have walked down this path. And, you know, there are some very obvious examples of people like Sechin, Igor Sechin, if you can call him an oligarch. I guess he is right head of Rosneft, one of the richest people in Russia. I mean, that's somebody who's been directly and intricately complicit in all the crimes committed by Putin over the years. I mean, somebody like that clearly belongs, you know, in a court of law to face accountability for everything he has done. Others are less black and white examples, but that's going to be for legal processes, for the rule of law infrastructure to address. But that's something that will have to be addressed. And there's going to be so many questions around here, right? It's not just the direct government machinery that's responsible, but it's the industrial environment that is aiding and abetting it, as you said. What about the propagandists? To me, they are just as much complicit as the people who are actually killing in Ukraine, because you can kill with words too. And to me, people like Vladimir Solovyov clearly belong in the dock, in a court of law. That is going to be a really difficult journey. But we have to pose these questions, and we have to pose them now. Because when that moment comes, when those 3 days happen, like they did in March 1917 and August 1991, when the regimes collapsed, it will be too late to figure that out. We have to have these conversations now. And thank you so much for raising that point.
I think that'll have to be our last question because it's almost 3:45. I have to thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Vladimir.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much, everyone.
Not only, I think this is a great example of a person who lives history, continues to live history, and is an historian. And looking back at the way we got here, to me, was very valuable. But also, again, getting back to moral courage. So, again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind words. Thank you. Thank you for this conversation, Jill. And I look forward to having lunch in Moscow. Thank you. Thank you.